Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Mike Gibb. I run accountsrecovery.net, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar on how to update training materials to address Regulation F. Regulation F, also known as the CFPB's debt collection rule, is going to require collection agencies to make a lot of changes to their operations. None are going to be more important than making sure collectors are aware of the changes and what they will have to do differently once the regulation goes into effect. Today in this webinar, which is being sponsored by TCN, we have a panel of experts here to talk about the changes that will need to be made to your training materials in order to be sure everyone is complying with Regulation F. Before introducing the panel, I want to take a quick second and talk about the accountsrecovery.net Slack channel. I just put a link in the chat window for anybody to click on. You can click on it and join today for free. You can join any day for free. If you're not already a member, we've got about 380 people who are members of the site. You can think of it like a big chat room that's only available to people in the ARM industry. I think we're over 14,000 messages that have been posted on the site, and we're actually in the middle of the second round of our first annual Logo Madness tournament to determine which company in the ARM industry has the best logo. So you can click on that link and join the Slack channel today for free and start participating and sharing and staying in touch with your colleagues in the ARM industry. Now, let me introduce you to today's speakers. Leslie Bender has spent more than 30 years handling compliance, regulatory, transactional, and legal matters for hospitals and financial services companies. Recognized as a national expert on HIPAA and other information privacy and security laws, she was one of the first privacy officers internationally accredited as a certified information privacy professional. She is currently a senior counsel in Clark Hill's Banking and Financial Services Group, specializing in corporate, compliance, privacy, transactional credit, and collection matters. Leslie is a past president of ACA International, serving as president in 2013-2014, and as an officer on its board of directors between 2011 and 2015. Sarah DeMoss is the Director of Compliance and Licensing at Premier Credit of North America. She also acts as in-house counsel for the organization. Besides general compliance matters like complaints, quality assurance, and auditing, she also oversees training, HR, and legal for the company. She's been at Premier for more than 6 years. Prior to joining the company, Sarah worked at the national collection law firm of Rausch Sturm and is licensed to practice law in both Indiana and Minnesota. As the owner and president of ARM Compliance Business Solutions, Sarah Wagerman works with organizations to drive compliant business practices through her consulting solutions. Sarah's personalized approach prepares financial institutions for regulatory examinations, manage litigation risk, and improve the consumer experience. Sarah is known for her passion in helping companies overcome their unique compliance and operational challenges through delivery of compliance risk assessments, policy development, service provider management and oversight, and executive level training programs designed to help financial services companies mitigate risk and maximize efficiency. Unfortunately, Beth Conklin is not able to participate today. The format for today's webinar is a panel discussion. We encourage everybody to submit questions, and we'll get to them during the course of our conversation today. To submit a question, please enter it into the Q&A tab on your Zoom webinar control panel or send it to us through the chat window. Okay, let's start our conversation for today. Let's start with a very specific and narrow question. Where would you recommend an agency start training its employees and collectors on Regulation F? I'm sure that's, there are a lot of ways we can go with this. So let's start our conversation there. And who am I going to pick on? Spinning my wheel. Sarah DeMoss, you joined first today, so I'm going to let you give our first answer.
Okay, lucky me. I'll start with who, and that way we can have our panel expand on what I'm saying. You want to start with your executives and your top management. From my perspective right now, you have to have their buy-in before you roll anything else out. They need to be knowledgeable when they're out at conferences, when they're talking to clients, that kind of thing. But also really, you're going to need resources. And they need to understand why you need so many IT resources, why your MAP attorney budget went up, that kind of thing. And so you're going to need to start with them before you roll anything out or get any further down the rules. And I would say next, as you get down into lower management, and then at the very end, I would say collectors. From my experience, training them too early on something, it just doesn't help anybody. But I also want to say that don't forget to overlook your clients, because we've been on a couple webinars where we've had our clients on and they seem a little bit I'm not quite as up to speed as the rest of us. And it's nothing against them. We just live and breathe and die by these kinds of things. And, they have an entire other type of business to run that isn't even focused in our industry. So you need to get ahead early with the clients, start understanding, explaining what's going on, their resources, things that you may need from them. That's where I would say you get started.
I think those were all excellent points, Sarah. I also agree. I've spent a lot of time since Regulation F has been published, spending lots of times with, executives, management, and compliance professionals across the industry. And I do think that the last line is probably your collectors, for a couple of reasons. One, there's going to be some technology advancements that happen due to this rule. And until you know what those technology advancements are going to look like, what the collector screen is going to look like, how the workflows are going to change, I think that's really critical, not to kind of, provide that information before you have all the details, basically. So I agree with everything Sarah said.
I agree with everything that the Sarahs said. I'm apparently the affirmative action for this program today. My name is not Sarah, but it's a lovely name. And I think that Sarah D has raised a good point that in order to get ready for and embrace all the change, the tone from the top is essential, and it needs to be supportive of the environment. But I think also Sarah W makes a good point that you need a plan. You need to coordinate with how all these moving parts, changes your software vendors are going to make, changes that perhaps your voice analytics vendors or other vendors are going to make. All of those things have to be part of a plan, and that plan should come from the top. I think one of the really interesting opportunities is that in the olden days, a safety measure was always to train consumer-facing people that if a consumer said, please stop calling, that we would characterize that as a ceased communication. And we might not attempt any other methods of communicating with that consumer. Not so much anymore under Reg F. Under Reg F now, we need to retrain our consumer-facing people to think about what is this consumer's communication preference. And certainly no means no, but training them to listen actively for changes. Please don't call me anymore. Okay, Ms. Bender, I won't call you anymore. How would you prefer we communicate with you? And here are your choices. We can email you, we can text you, we can contact you on WhatsApp, we can in-message you on Instagram, whatever are the choices. So you're going to need to kind of convince your folks that don't call doesn't mean don't communicate anymore, and that people will have to actively listen and learn new probing questions so that they can learn. You've got the consumer on the phone. Hooray, this is great. Now let's find out how the consumer does want to communicate. And who knows, maybe you'll find out that it's a lot more affordable to communicate with the consumer via email, via a self-service portal. But I think that's an area that's going to require some significant, training. And I see we already have a question that I can put over to the Sarahs. Kat O'Brien, hey, good to see you, Kat, in the audience. Kat O'Brien says, do you see a danger in training your collectors or your consumer-facing folks if you have people that man email or woman email or chats to put out all the options? Maybe that would require some type of different strategy. What do you, Sarahs, think?
Well, I think it's only a danger if you don't have processes in place for each type of mechanism. So if you don't have a chat option, or if your texting is only for certain things, or you're only going to use email for if you have consent in different places in the rule, then it's a danger listing them, because once you put it out there, you have to be able to do it. If you can get something in place for all of these, then listing it just from the operations money perspective, like you said, at the end of the day, it might save you money. Additionally, we're having harder and harder time with people answering the phone with caller ID. So we really, really need to be ahead of different ways to communicate with people and their preferences. So if you can get it together in time, I would say go for it.
Yeah, and I think the the only thing I would add to that would be if your process was to, just cease communications altogether on an account, listing out multiple different channels of potential communication methods, I don't think gives you any more risk if they say, I don't want you to contact me via any channel, right? You could raise the question, I think this is, or I would also raise this. It gives you an opportunity to educate the consumer, right? So I am perfectly happy with saying no more phone calls to you, Miss Bender. However, this debt is going to remain active, although we're not calling you and communicating with you. Is there another way you would like to learn about additional information regarding your account or offers we might have, whatever it's going to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's, it opens up a really great way for you to educate the consumer, and maybe you don't really have a cease communication, all of them, right? You have just somebody who works nights, whatever. So
that raises an interesting question, your answer and your earlier answer, Sarah W. I know you have some unique insights into how vendors might prepare us to be compliant. Do you think we're going to need to do some training for our vendors just to make sure they're on the same page that we are?
I think there's a possibility that might be necessary, yes. I know you've got tons of experience in the healthcare space, Leslie. I think that I work with a lot of clients that are in the healthcare space, and that I've been pushing one, to educate clients, number one, because we know that there's a big disconnect in healthcare and the debt collection processes. But I think the same potential disconnect could happen with our vendors. I was very happy to see lots of vendors in the very well done trainings last week at the RMA conference. But their level of understanding is going to look different than, say, the people who are in the weeds all the time with this regulation and seeing the things that can break down. So I do think communication with your vendors right now is really critical regarding Reg F.
Okay, so then let me ask this, as we look at the rule, should agencies be sharing all of the details in the rule with employees? Do you sort of tell them everything, just transparent, so they kind of know everything that's going on? Or do you tell them just sort of right now, or at least maybe just right now, what they need to know about? Who wants to go first on that one?
I think it would be helpful. I'm not opposed to the idea of explaining to collectors, like if you have a regular routine where you kind of huddle up maybe on a regular cadence, it's probably not a bad idea for them to at least know there's some moving pieces happening, right? That there is an, Regulation F is here. We have a potential date of implementation that might get delayed, but we're going to be making some changes, whether it's system changes, whether it's, mentally prepare them in case they hear anything about it on the phone, which I don't know if that's really likely or not, but getting too far into the weeds, they may not need to know everything. Like they probably don't need to know how consent to email is coming over from, say, the creditor or whatever quite yet, if you're not going to utilize all those different procedures as an example. What you're going to utilize, I would think, would be in your ultimate training materials. So.
But I do think that it is important for people to be trained, especially people on the phone, to be trained to listen for revocations or changes. And I see my good friend Ron Brown, hello Ron, I hope you're well today, has asked a question about how do we memorialize some of the permissions we have with consumers to communicate in a particular way. And I know, Ron, I've heard you speak very passionately about how important it is every time we have a customer on the phone to just take a second to verify we have good demographics for them. Hey, Ron, Mr. Brown, thanks for speaking with us today. Before we end this call, I just want to make sure that your preferred methods for us communicating with you are still email and voice call. And you know that we have an address on file. Do you want to just confirm what's the best way you think or the best method? With respect to email, for sure, I think that any opportunity we have to have the customer email us and say, please email me going forward. So if we don't have a customer experience at abccollectionagency.com yet, now might be a good time to set up such a thing, or whatever you want to call it that's customer friendly. But getting the customer to email in that they're giving you permission to email is certainly an excellent start. And so the same is probably true with texting and some other strategies, but there's some pitfalls with texting. Today, we don't have a reliable reassigned numbers database, and theoretically, we can't text unless every 60 days we've re-verified a customer's correct number for texting. So until that happens, and by the way, you can probably see over my shoulder, I have some unicorns here. The unicorns and the reassigned numbers database could be coming at the same time. So when that happens, but otherwise, we're going to have to verify every 60 days that we do have permissions to text. So as usual, Ron, you're asking a great question. And it's something also we should train people about. Back to Mike's question, I think we should also train people, if we're going to change our initial collection notice format, we should train people on all the components of that letter and how to understand them in case they come up during a call. Having listened to lots of calls in my day through voice analytics and other call monitoring and call calibration programs, it is embarrassing for collectors not to know what's in your letters. So if you're going to change your letters, you might want to train on that too. What do you think about that, Sarah?
Yeah, we have a database where we have examples of letters so that if a consumer calls in and they say, hey, you know, I got this letter, the collectors can flip. Some are better than others at navigating it. I do think to the question of how much you tell in your audience, I think you just don't forget who your audience is. So I think it's important when you tell collectors to do something, if you just tell them to do it, you kind of have that rebellious attitude where, you know, you kind of have some resistance. But if you give them the reason, I mean, they're smart, they're interested, they want to know why. But you might say, hey, you know, the CFPB that we teach you guys about, you know, they have new rules coming out. Instead of getting real detailed into Reg Act, you know, blah, 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 and talking so much like an attorney. Versus the higher level employees, you can get into it a little bit more in detail. But even with your stakeholders, when you're talking to your IT department, you know, they really only need to know the parts that they need to know. And if you overwhelm everybody too early with too much information, they're going to be fatigued by the time you roll this out.
Right. Whenever I do any of my Reg F trainings, it's funny because I get about halfway through the rule with my clients and I hear, their mind just wants to explode. Like they feel super overwhelmed. And so I just stopped even trying to do a high level overview of all of Reg F because it was just too much. And, you know, one of the things that I've tried to do with my trainings with just that level is this isn't as scary as it sounds, right? And really putting it in a workflow for them, helping them understand this is all doable with the right technology resources, with the right education, making sure everybody's on the same page, right? And so, yeah, I'm with you. This can be very overwhelming for all levels of people right now. If this isn't what they live and breathe like the three of us do.
What? But I think that you can also do like before and afters. So you can have case studies, simple, not like law school, you know, where you say, here's how the letter looked before, here's how the letter looks after. Or here's how
Yep.
call looked before, here's how a call looked after. Or up until Reg F took effect, we weren't sure if we could email, text, or use other methods. We are sure we can now, so long as we respect guardrails. And I think that
That's a great approach, Leslie. Yeah.
because then it's practical. They don't want to know the legislative history. They don't want to know that there's a 60-day extra window of time to come into compliance. And 60 days, by the way, isn't a heck of a long time if you have to work with your vendors and you have multiple call sites, or you might have decided that you're going to keep a lot of your employees working remotely. Then you have to engage them in all their remote locations. So, I think that keeping it practical and looking at maybe the transactional components of debt collection might help a little.
Mhm.
I'd throw in there too, don't forget your back office. So, we're always so focused on collectors and then IT programming, but you're going to have consumer satisfaction and complaint teams. You're going to have QA teams that are looking for different things, correspondence. I mean, even the mailroom is going to receive.
The mailroom's going to be big with those tear-offs. Yeah.
So make sure
The tear-offs that won't have disclosures on the back of them, you mean?
Right. Exactly.
Why do we call it the back office anyway? That just doesn't sound good. Why don't we call them the gladiators or the, I don't know why we call support
Unicorns.
teams. Why do we call support teams the back
They're
office?
pretty critical. Yeah.
They're our lifeline.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, I am just going to interrupt for a second and just temporarily hit the pause button on our discussion because I want to say a few words about TCN, the sponsor of today's webinar. TCN provides cost-effective call center solutions for traditional contact centers, collection agencies, and thousands of businesses worldwide. TCN has continually stayed current with TCPA and CAPB changes by introducing enhancements to its core platform, one of which is TCN's natural language compliance, which uses smart algorithms to build compliance rules naturally. Simply type your rule into the TCN Compliance Manager, and the natural language compliance engine will build an easy to understand compliance rule. One example of a rule could be deny outbound calls before 8 a.m. and after 9 p.m. You could even type a rule that would limit 7 calls in 7 days. There is no limit to the number of rules TCN's processing engine can compute. TCN software is a platform suite that also provides built-in data management services that eliminate data entry errors, business intelligence with reporting dashboards, call recording with storage, smart IVR with payment capabilities, speech analysis and transcription, and much more. Regardless of size, location, or application, TCN can provide robust solutions for your call center and collection agency. Give TCN a call or visit them at www.tcn.com for more information. TCN has also published an ebook available for download on their website with regards to everything, covering everything with regards to Regulation F. I just put a link in the chat window that you can use to download the book for free. So click on that and do that today. Thanks again to TCN for sponsoring today's webinar. Okay, I want to circle back to something we were talking. You mentioned earlier in our conversation, and was sort of my next discussion topic, and that is how far in advance would you advise agencies to start training employees on the changes they're going to have to make? We talked about needing a plan, having a plan. So how does this sort of fit in? Given the pending delay, should agencies wait until it becomes clear that the rule is going into effect, or is it because there's so much that you have to do, you should start now? I'm curious where everybody thinks on that. And Leslie, we'll start with you this time.
Well, I think the rule is going to take effect. I think that we will continue to see a number of policy statements, just like we saw today, a new policy statement about tenant evictions and debt collectors. So for anybody in the audience that hasn't noticed that today, the CFPB has been very active. I've never seen such an active acting director of any agency, but I'm only 63 years old. So I would take a look at that for anybody in the audience that is in the business of collecting rent or tenant evictions. But I think it is important, since Regulation F is interpreting the FDCPA, it creates a lot of clarity around things like inconvenient time or what are good locational calls that we can do. And I think that for agencies that work especially late stage debt collection, perhaps training on some of the strategies Reg F maps for locational calls and making sure that those are the steps that your folks who make those calls are following would be helpful. It's an area where we really have not ever had a lot of clarification. It is clear that the CFPB is permitting locational calls to continue. And so if you're working late stage and that is important to your business, you know, and maybe stepping back from that, any feature of this rule that is important to your business, you should start looking at hard. There are a number of companies that have implemented letters very similar to the model initial collection notice. And in two circuits, the CFPB filed an amicus position supporting those agencies. And we had another circuit approve that the model letter approach. So the model letter might be an area, locational calls might be an area, and preparing your strategy for stepping away from debt parking or passive debt collection, where you put a trade line on a consumer's credit file before you have sent the initial collection notice, notifying the consumer about the debt. Those would be 3 areas I would take a hard look at and decide whether or not you want to start doing some training in those areas.
Sarah, is there anything you want to follow up with on that?
No, I do agree. For best practice type things, I think you can be rolling them out now, and it's a little bit even not necessarily as much part of the rule as just things that maybe you weren't doing or you need to tighten up or remind everybody to do. As far as getting into the details, I think you need to get your IT programming in those kinds of things set up first before you roll any of the nitty gritty safe harbor detail things you're going to rely on or that are very specific. So I would say it's a little bit too early to train on those types of things.
Yeah, I would say if you're going to make major changes to what your business looks like today. So let's say you don't leverage any digital communication channel and November 30th, you're planning on launching it. Then I think you might need a little bit of headway. You know, if you're doing a 180 on your communication styles, you're going to need a little bit more runway for your training program. Also, of course, the size and complexity of your company is going to play a part in that as well. But I think that if you're just making maybe a few tweaks, then, you know, you might be looking at 90, 60 days out and then really start pushing down to all the collectors and all of that and changing those training materials for your new hires and things of that nature.
And I see, Mike, we have a lot of vendors in our audience today. So, you know, we have Linda Straub-Jones, we have Mary McDaniel, we have some wonderful vendors in the audience. And I think it is important to wrap them into some of your training decisions too. Many of them are also developing training programs to help their customers really understand how to use things. And, you know, off to the side, if you're planning to change some of your telephony strategies, TCN, who's our sponsor today, sponsored a beautiful webinar that my good friend Dave Kaminsky did a few weeks ago with Mike, helping sort of unpack some of the telephony things that you also need to be thinking about. So you need a lot of peripheral vision and integrating your training with training that may be available through your vendors or bringing them in so they can see some of the challenges and obstacles could be a really valuable exercise during this implementation window.
I actually, yeah, I completely agree. Sorry, Sarah.
No, you're fine.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, you can lean into some of your vendors and their training of you know, some of the changes. I know everybody is working towards providing solutions that help with Regulation F. I mean, there's I don't think anyone's sitting on their thumbs right now, right? Like everyone's working towards that goal. So definitely leverage those relationships to help you with this. I agree.
Yeah, anything you can automate and take out of the collector's hands or make it not as a one-off kind of training thing is the best. So if you've got vendors that can help you do that in IT programming and support, I would explore it. It may seem like a lot at first, but it's definitely worth it versus a lawsuit in the end.
There's a great question in the chat box. I'm going to grab Mike if it's okay. Somebody asked about whether or not we can recommend any e-learning vendors. I love adult education, as I know Sarah and Sarah do. And I can tell you that it is super easy to put up your own e-learning very quickly and very inexpensively if you have good content. You know, you can set up a Google Classroom, you can use Flipgrid. There are so many resources that have just exploded during the pandemic to allow people to push out content. And if you would like me to point you to any of those, but you can put up your own e-learning really easily and really affordably through some of these tools that have come into the market quickly to help parents educate their kids, you know, to help teachers get to kids. And, you know, feel free to contact me. I would be happy to point you to any of them, but you can pop up an e-learning training, not to take away from Docebo or M-Train, that have APIs that will talk to your HR system or your, you know, whatever you use to manage your human resources. But there are a lot of resources that are pretty close to free that you can put up that look super cool, that have some blog features with them, if you need to do it in a hurry.
No, I'm glad you said that, Leslie, because I was actually going to say a standard e-learning course might be a disservice to you. And I say that because every single company is going to uniquely adapt these rules. There will be companies who say, I don't want the safe harbor. I'm not worried about the safe harbor because my risk has been low doing it the way that there's going to be decisions that are made that, you know, at your executive and management levels, that I don't know that the training, it will be too generic is what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm. Yep, good point.
One other tool I'll throw in there that I think most of you may be familiar with, and that's Kahoot. If you're not familiar with that, for testing, I know a lot of people have used that. So there's a bunch of other questions that have come in here. Let's see here. Where would I start? When should a client start asking agencies for policies and procedure updates? If they haven't already, I guess.
Question. So as somebody who spent years and years in the debt buyer world before I became a consultant, I would ask your agencies first for their plan and what are they going to adapt to, right? And so that would be my first step. If you've already done that, then I would provide some sort of a timeline for when you would expect updated policies and procedures to be completed. So, you know, that might be 3 months before implementation date, right? Or I'm just using that as an arbitrary number. But if, you know, see where they're at in the process, you definitely, if you're outsourcing to collection agencies, you definitely want to know what their plan is. And you might be part of the decision-making in that plan too. So keep those lines of communication open for sure.
And again, back to what we said in the beginning, where the Sarahs talked about the tone from the top and having a plan. Do not try to update all your P&P at the same time. You know, prioritize, because something might shake out from one area. For example, let's say you decide to deal with your telephony first. because you want to make sure that you don't run afoul of the 7-call limit, right? And you want to make sure you correctly interpret it in your environment. And if you have creditor clients that require you to segregate their work, you might have to deal with some of these issues programmatically and with your clients. So pick some of these topics that have tendrils into other areas and update the policies and procedures for those first, in case something falls out that you didn't expect, or in case you find out that one of your vendors you hoped would be nimble enough just isn't nimble enough or isn't understanding. And I think that these are things that are all within your purview to do, but I wouldn't recommend tackling them all at once or in a vacuum. Just like you like to have taste testers. I don't know if anyone remembers Betty Crockett. There used to be taste testers and whatever. You want taste testers. You want to try some changes. You want to roll them out to a team, to try them out and to tell you what's good and bad about them, and get them engaged. And then when it is time for you to train them out, they'll help you with the heavy lift.
Yeah, on the agency side, I'd say it's okay to ask us for a roadmap right now, but I mean, to ask us for policy docs and procedure docs, it's just too early, and we just won't have them. But it's a good conversation to start. And then I think that goes back into the topic of this is who do you train, when, and why? And you definitely want to make sure we call them back office. We're going to call them superstar back office people. We'll have to come up with a good name, but you want to make sure they know what they're talking about to an extent. You don't want them stuck on a client call. It's just a run of the mill client services call, and then all of a sudden they start asking about the rules, and your client services rep is left hanging. It's our job to make sure that they can speak knowledgeably enough to say, we have a plan, I can get you in touch with compliance, but you don't want them to say, what? I've never heard of that.
That's a really great point, Sarah.
What's Reg F again?
Maybe we can convince that guy, Mike Gibb, that has the Slack channel, to have a contest to rename the back office support people when he gets done with the logo contest.
I'm writing it down.
That's why he hosts these.
Right. Let's see here. So looking at the rule, everything, is there an area or areas that you think are going to be the most difficult to either teach to sort of just general employees, whether front office, back office, for now we're calling it back office, or collectors? Is there going to be something that, what do you think is going to be the most difficult transition or change that, employees in an agency are going to have to make? And since I think we only have one person working at an agency, I get to pick on her first and ask her.
It's going to be the communication preferences for us. It's going to be making sure the system can handle inputting the preference, understanding the opt-outs, getting the constant, recertification that it's okay. Those kinds of things are going to be the hardest to train. When you talk about call caps, that affects operations pretty heavily, but at the same time, our system pretty much does it for us, and they know if they try to dial an account, they can't, there's a compliance reason. So they need to know those things, but not as in depth as when they're talking to somebody and reading between the lines. Because from a practicality standpoint too, not everything comes in a queue. Yes, I absolutely would like email, but not this, but this, it's always kind of a FU, for lack of a better word, sometimes jumble from consumers sometimes. So we've got to make sure we're categorizing it the right way.
I think also this is going to be an overlap with your vendor area. So like if you have a collection system that is going to have either a banner that says mail return, or a, communication consent matrix where something would be now on the face page that pops up when a customer inbounds, those are things that would be very important to know and to train people to look for, so they can protect you from running afoul of some of the things that could happen. I am concerned with the prohibition against debt parking only because for companies that are data furnishers, you might not have realized that your skip mail accounts were still credit reporting if you don't have a tactic baked into your system to prevent them from credit reporting if there's a mail return. And these are things that maybe they seem silly, or maybe it's just a pocket of accounts because when you onboarded certain clients or whatever, but understanding truly how your system supports or doesn't support some of the changes occasioned by Reg F, and making sure your collectors can navigate well through the system fields or windows or whatever GUI interfaces or dashboards or whatever you call them, will be really important for people to have a fluency in that, to look for warning signs.
Mhm.
Well, that's a good point, Leslie, because we keep talking about doing new processes and procedures. And there's parts of the rules that you kind of skip up, or, oh yeah, we don't debt park, so I can skip to the next one. But it's also a good time to go back through your old procedures and update them and make sure they're still going to meet this. There's going to be a lot of scrutiny in this area. There's going to be consumer attorneys that are just super excited to get started. And this also gives you a good idea of where the CFPB is going to be focused. There are different areas, even if the rules change or if they expand. It gives you kind of the basics of communicating, credit reporting, debt buyers, those kinds of out of stat, those kinds of things are the areas you want to focus on outside of what they're making us do.
Another question from the audience. If mailing the initial notice is the standard method of notifying consumers of new accounts assigned for collection, and a consumer has asked to be emailed only in the past, is there a violation of Regulation F? I'm guessing it's a second account, maybe, where earlier the consumer had said they only want to be emailed. When you get a second account placed, can you email, or do you have to treat that separately? I think is the question.
Who wants to take that first?
I'm guessing Sarah doesn't.
No, I can. I was going to say, well, you have 3 different types of procedures if you want to take advantage of the safe harbor, right? And so it is for the consent or the opt-in is per a particular debt. So that does say that in the rule. I'm not a lawyer, so I won't go down that path. I would think that you can send the validation in an email, the validation letter in an email, if it meets the requirements of one of those 3 procedures. So on that note, I think Leslie probably wants to jump in here. I feel like she's telepathically wants to say something.
Oh, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think the interesting thing, and this is what I think about a lot, which people always wonder what I think about a lot, here goes. I think about what does it look like to the consumer? Like, I wish that we had a smoother process from the day a debt is created all the way through. And, I think that the more we act the same throughout, the less unhappy consumers will end up being. So if when a consumer incurs a debt, we can convince our creditor clients to get all sorts of preferences and permissions and contact information, making it clear to the consumer whether we really think that they can be transferable or not, make it clear to the consumer. But I think that a lot of times consumers don't understand. If they're getting a bunch of collection notices from us, they don't understand that some of our creditors might have different rules for whether we can or can't packet them or aggregate them. And they don't understand, why did we get this in a letter form and this in an email? Or why did we get 5 separate letters from your company? And in healthcare, it's even more confounding because you might have had 1 ER visit and you get 5 separate letters from the agency, from the anesthesiologist, from the laboratory, from the EMT company, whatever. So I think that it's frustrating to consumers, and I don't think they understand why we would send different things. So whatever you can do early on in the process to ask for permission to packet accounts, if your clients let you, or talk to your clients about how frustrating it might be. Also might be an angle to think about here.
And that's a conversation. I mean, that would seem to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, Leslie, that's a conversation you can have at any point, not just because of Regulation F. But
Oh, for
anytime
sure.
you can try and make it a little easier, that should be part of the ongoing dialogue that an agency might have with its creditor clients.
Yes, and a lot are very picky about, because they have made commitments, privacy commitments. You knew I'd get here eventually. Privacy commitments to their customers. They want you to carry those forward. Well, hello, how about a handshake letter? And how about, making sure the customer expects that Premier is going to have your account in 30 days if you haven't resolved, and this is who you can get in touch with there, and here's their contact info, and here's where their nice lady, Sarah DeMoss, is that you can talk to, if all else fails, whatever, that's why all these features that Reg F has opened the door for are worth thinking about and are things to think about well before January 29th.
Okay. We've talked about sort of the conversations that collectors might be having with consumers. What if a collector gets, someone on the phone who starts asking the questions about the rule or starts mentioning different things about the rule? How would you advise them to handle those types of conversations? And I'll just throw it open to, I won't pick on anybody. I'll let whoever wants to go first can go first this time.
I have a bachelorette observation about this. If a customer brings something up in a collection call that you wouldn't hear on the bachelorette, your spidey sense should be aware that something is odd. So a consumer talking about Reg F, I recommend you train your people to recognize as a not bachelorette topic, and therefore something that should concern them, that it could be a baiting call. Just my, it's just the ordinary person doesn't know the sections of the FCRA you might have violated, doesn't know all the jargon that we work very hard to train our collection staff not to say in calls, So if somebody's saying Reg F, passive debt collection and similar things in a call, that should be escalated, or that should set off some warning bells.
Right.
But I will say that there have been, when part 1 and part 2 of the rule came out, as someone who looks at a lot of different news sites every day, there were a lot of mainstream media articles. Debt collectors are coming to your social media. Debt collectors are coming into your social media. So what if you get, you might not get someone that mentions debt parking or Regulation F, but what if you get someone who asks, are you going to start contacting me via social media? Something like that kind of pertains to the rule. What in those situations, not necessarily a bachelorette question, but still something that you might get.
Or you just have to train them to know enough. If that's something that we have planned, then the answer is, yeah, I think we're working on it, and that may be something we can offer you in the future, if you haven't programmed it yet. But in general, when it gets tricky or somebody's asking off the wall, it's, I'd be happy to get that over to my compliance department, and they can follow up or that kind of thing, because if they know just enough information to be dangerous, they're going to keep walking into a hole. And like Leslie said, usually if somebody's asking, they're asking for a reason. And whether they know exactly what they're talking about or not, they're trying to get to something, and you want to make sure you don't step in it.
Yeah, I do think that might be where you do some preliminary training to know that there's things happening in preparation for the implementation of Regulation F. But give them a standard line, or two, or script to say, we are working through the requirements, something along those lines, but not go into too much detail, because I heard, because there was a lot of media coverage on, the garnishment of wages and stimulus money. I heard people who were like calling in and saying, are you going to garnish my wages? And and they had to quickly, well, we don't do that, whatever. But, sometimes the media coverage we get is actually creating conversations that we wouldn't expect to have, right? And so I do think we need to be prepared for those. So that's a good point, Mike.
I would
And
say
just
to
like
use
with
some of your-
COVID and go ahead, Sarah.
No, go ahead. Let's say you're fine.
I was just going to say, you're absolutely right, Sarah. Like when we heard about COVID accommodations and deferrals, all of a sudden every call talked about,
Mhm.
How could you call me during COVID? Everybody's having a hardship, and,
Mhm.
So the media can influence some of the stuff that happens in calls. And that's why it's important for your training team or your compliance team or yourself, if that's your job in your spare time, to pay attention to what the media is covering. Maybe subscribe to Mike's, newsletter. I mean, it's pretty quick read, and Mike always has his finger on the pulse of what the media has got. So, make sure that some of your thought leaders, and maybe convince some of your, supervisors and your other production leaders and the people from that department that shall not be called the back office anymore. They can read Mike's articles and, they can self-educate and they can talk about them maybe in some of your team meetings.
Mhm.
And you can use them as a focus group before you roll a talk off out, right? I mean, they're the ones that are on the phones all day. They know what off the wall questions are going to come. I mean, that's why I like doing collector trainings. It takes a lot of work, but you get to hear all the what if, and you think, well, I never thought about that because in my brain, it's going to work X, Y, and Z. And they laugh at you and say, yeah, well, that's not what happens on a call. So, as you start to roll out these talk offs, say what kind of questions are going to come up. And then you can get ahead of it and you can start helping them with scripts.
Yeah.
How often, Sarah, do you find that, you actually sort of are able to kind of, use those either questions or use those focus groups to try and identify, changes to a script or answers that you don't normally, may not have normally thought about?
Honestly, every time we roll out a new policy or procedure on them, I try to at least pull a few in and ask how they think this is going to affect them. Not because they get to vote on whether they're going to do it or not, but because I want to get ahead of it. And they're really pretty good about raising issues. You have to be careful it doesn't derail because, sometimes they want to spend, 3 hours on something that happened once 6 years ago on a call. So as long as you can keep it focused enough, I think it's helpful.
I would agree with that. I love doing collector training too. I learned so much from that. I also just like to have fun with them and I can, it's just fun. But they are the best at poking holes in stuff and it gives me a different challenge because, okay, well, let's back up. And sometimes I uncover something that's broken within a company that I didn't even realize was broken, right? Like, because whatever, the question didn't come up or something didn't come up, it looked like it was where you find out all sorts of stuff. So I would definitely encourage, getting that buy-in and that feedback from, a focus group of collectors. I love that.
And you learn so much, right? I mean,
really do.
Being a lawyer, you could sit in your ivory tower, such as it is, but I always learn so much because the cool thing about collectors is they bring so much life experience to the job. And, they can tell you what they're hearing, and they also bring some of their own stuff to the job. So I think that I love to do live collector training and that's why I love the Collector Live program, Mike, that you do, because I think it really gives a great opportunity to collectors to process information,
Yep, agreed.
So if I'm going to try and summarize the last 56 minutes or so, and probably, do it terribly. There should be some sort of interim training now, just in case collectors are getting questions about social media or whatever. It should be already started if you haven't, contacting with your creditor clients. You should have a roadmap, if not starting to already work on your policies and procedures on what you're going to do kind of moving forward. And, sort of really kind of in terms of updating or training collectors, probably too early for that, but definitely should start building at least have the plan or the framework of a plan in place. Did I summarize that right? Did I miss anything? And it's completely okay to tell me I screwed it all up.
You said it eloquently.
Oh, that's never happened in my life. So now I know you're lying.
But yes, you
I
summed
would
it up
also
pretty well.
say, look at your budgets now,
Okay.
because you need to understand if you're going to engage these vendors. Like I said earlier, get a good map attorney on board and that kind of thing. So that way you're not super shocked at the end of the year when you don't know where this money was spent.
Sarah Wagerman, Leslie, is there anything else I left out? Anything else to add before we wrap up today?
No, I think you
Thank
nailed
you
it.
to you, and thank you. What a great audience, great questions, and thank you to TCN for sponsoring us.
Yes. Well, Sarah, Leslie, thank you on behalf of everybody watching and listening for lending your expertise and your perspective to this important topic and to this conversation today. This was a great discussion. I really appreciate your participation. So thank you on behalf of everybody who watched. Thanks to everybody who watched and listened. Really appreciate your continued support. Do me a favor when you get a chance, go to tcn.com to check TCN out and show them a little support for their continued sponsorships with these webinar series. This has been great. There's a link. I put it in the chat window. It should pop up on your screen. You'll get an email tomorrow to share your feedback on the event, as well as any other ideas. Today and tomorrow, I am planning May webinars. So if there's something you want to see covered in May, get it to me in the next 24 hours, and I'm sure you're going to see it. So click on that link and share that. I put links in for tomorrow's webinar as well in the chat window on getting involved in state associations, and on Wednesday on the model, not necessarily the model validation notice, but what you're going to have to include in your validation, whether you're using the model validation notice or your own notice once the regulation goes into effect. So you can sign up for that. And with that, I'm going to wrap things up. So thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your day, and everyone take care. Sarah, Leslie, thank you again. Great job.
Thank you. Bye, Sarah's.